Well, good evening. It's good to see all of you tonight, and I would like to invite you to take your Bibles and turn along with me to the book of 2 Samuel in chapter 9. 2 Samuel chapter 9, we're going to reference a few other verses along the way, but this will be the first text that we'll be reading together tonight. Just as we get started, I do want to say that it is such a great grace and a privilege to get to be with you here. That is always the case whenever we have God's people together and we can open up His Word, we can sing and praise and encourage each other. I also appreciate you just being flexible with us on how we can get the meeting started. It's hard to find those times when everything can just come together and everyone's available for a whole week of study like this. And so I appreciate you letting me start in the evening. We just finished up our meeting over in Northwood today. And so I'm very much looking forward to now switching gears from being just the one who gets to sit and listen to now getting to deliver some lessons myself. Again, 2 Samuel chapter 9 is going to be the first place that we turn to together tonight. But just a few words before we get there. I want us to start off thinking tonight about the power of emotions. And I don't think I don't mean to drive our thoughts to anything about getting swept up in emotion or some sort of artificial emotionalism. But emotions as a shared experience can be something that is very powerful to move us, to cause us to feel. For instance, if we witness someone in all innocence experiencing a situation of great joy, well, you can't help but smile. You feel elated as well. On the other hand, if you witness someone who's suffering, they're experiencing great grief, then you're probably going to feel pain yourself. And when we see those who are acting out of a sense of compassion and selflessness, well, that sort of drives up that feeling in our own hearts that we want to do better and we want to be more like that. And so in that vein, I think that one of the greatest things that we can witness, one of the greatest emotions that we can take part of is when we witness forgiveness. When we see someone who is letting go of all of the hate, all of the anger that they have been just holding on to, that they've been nurturing. When we see someone who, having done so, they feel this terrible burden finally being lifted off of their shoulders. We see those relationships restored. What we're really seeing when someone forgives another is the giving of one of the only gifts that has real lasting value, that never fades or is tarnished. Consider some of these great biblical examples of forgiveness. I think you just have to be somewhat robotic to read the reunion of Joseph and his brothers and not feel something. That when you get to the point where he reveals himself and he's breaking down into tears over this, it's hard not to start growing misty-eyed yourself. Or even before that, Jacob and Esau, these brothers who have been at odds for years, and the last time that we saw them, they were really one's wanting to kill the other, and one's fleeing, and one's deceiving, but now they've come back together, and that brotherhood is restored. There's unity once more. Or the thief on the cross who one moment is reviling the Lord with insults. He's joining in the mockery. And then some moments later, we hear Jesus extending an invitation for him to join him that day in paradise. And we could go on, and you're surely thinking of the many that I've sort of skipped over to get to those. But we read those stories when hurt and sin, those things have been dealt with, and we can turn to forgiveness and healing. And they should inspire us to be more compassionate in our own relationships. They should help us, or they should drive us to try and restore any sort of division that exists in our own relationships with our brethren, with our friends, our neighbors. And they should all serve as a great reminder of the forgiveness that all of us who have been baptized into Christ now share in. So what we're going to do tonight is look at, I think, one of the more unique accounts of reconciliation. because it involves men who have never met each other before, and yet all of the situations in their life have come together as such that they provide these grievances that could have been held against each other, even though they haven't necessarily been committed toward one another. The potential for great hurt and ill will was very strong. But it ends with these wonderful new relationships being formed. And I think the results give us one of the most beautiful and powerful stories of forgiveness and reconciliation. So again, 2 Samuel chapter 9, a little more context before we begin to read there. We are in the reign of David. I say we're early on in the reign of David, probably somewhere toward the latter end of the first quarter of his 40-year reign. But we're dealing at a time when his reign has been solidified by God. In fact, that's really what you read sort of chapter after chapter leading up to this. You'll recall that David's initial ascent to the throne is something that's marked by struggle. He has been on the run for years from Saul, and even when he finally becomes king, it's not under a unified or over a unified Israel. But now the kingdom is all under his control, is all under his rule, and so you see chapters talking about God granting him victory over his enemies. Or you see chapters that describe all of the wealth that God has now blessed David with. And so it's a time where he's really at the peak of his powers from a physical perspective, and it's a time where he might turn inward and focus only on self, but David, being the man that he is, turns outward. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, then David said, "Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him loving kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king said, 'Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the loving kindness of God?' And Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet.' So the king said to him, 'Where is he?' And Ziba said to the king, 'Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar.' Then King David sent and took him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar." So this text introduces us to the two principal characters for our discussion this evening. We have King David, and we have the crippled grandson of Saul, Mephibosheth. And I want to stress, I'm not trying to fabricate some sort of situation. The context is clearly David is seeking an opportunity to do good. He's not inquiring, is there anyone that I have yet to snuff out that may be on my list of enemies? And yet, our passage is still setting up a confrontation between two men who, at least on paper, ought to be enemies. If we just read these in isolation, there's little to no tension in these verses. But what's about to happen is a meeting between two houses, two powers in the land that up until very recently have been at open war with one another. For one of these men, David, it means bringing someone before him to show mercy who is a potential challenger to the throne, a potential enemy. For another, it means facing the one who has taken the position that was previously occupied by your family, putting yourself in his hands and at his mercy. But before we get to the meeting between these two men, I think it'll be helpful for us to flesh out their background and what makes this meeting so tense when it finally happens. Let's think about David's relationship with the house of Saul. And really, when you start and you think about all of the things that Saul had done to David, even in spite of the fact that David was such good friends with Jonathan, it's still easy to think, I can't believe he's wanting to do anything good for the house of Saul. When I think about the relationship that David had with King Saul, I think of it in the context of unrequited loyalty, of unappreciated loyalty. You will remember that David starts off as a helpful and trusted aide to Saul. But he's very popular, he has success, and all of this success eventually breeds suspicion and distrust. And so you may remember it's not very long after David has entered into the service of Saul that we can read in 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 10, that while David is there trying to soothe the soul of Saul by playing the harp, Saul picks up the spear, the javelin, and attempts to take the life of David. Saul eventually figures out that his own personal efforts have fallen somewhat short, and so he begins to be crafty. And in chapter 18 and verse 25, he sends David off on increasingly difficult missions. Things that we would say in today's vernacular, suicide missions. You're going to go and you're going to kill these hundreds of Philistines. Well, eventually that plotting to take David's life becomes kind of the worst kept secret in Israel. And Saul, by chapter 19 and verse 11, he just starts sending men to straight go kill David. And that's really when David begins to flee for his life and spends the better part of a decade on the run. I don't think any of us consider or would imagine the life as a fugitive as particularly glamorous. And yet, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that during that decade, there was just no peace that was known by David. There was never a moment where he could really be at ease and not worry about the threat of Saul. The closest thing that you might say would come to it is when he's sort of living undercover with the Philistines and incognito there. I think about one instance in particular. If you want to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel chapter 23. This occasion, David has saved a city from being plundered by the enemies of Israel. And you would think, David's come along, he's saved the lives of all the people in this city. Surely they're going to be appreciative. They're going to repay him for his goodness. But they turn around and they make plans to surrender him to Saul. Verse 12, David inquiring of God, then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And Yahweh said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. Now it was told to Saul that David had escaped Keilah, so he ceased going out in pursuit. And David stayed in the wilderness and the strongholds and remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hands. I think that's a good microcosm of the life of David. You can never be at peace. You can never just rest on your laurels, because here is someone who is literally trying to find you every day for a decade, hoping to put you to death. And all of that is on top of what I kind of think of as just a general attitude of contempt, of disregard from Saul toward David. You remember initially the promises that were made for the one who would take Goliath or kill Goliath. One of the things on that list of the bounty was, if you take out Goliath, you get to marry the king's daughter. Well, Saul, in one of his initial insults to David, swaps it out. You don't get to marry the promised daughter. You'll have to marry this other daughter of mine. And then eventually, when David's on the run, you read in 1 Samuel 25, verse 44, that Saul gives away that daughter, who was already joined in marriage to David, gives her away to someone else. All of that comes together to say that what Saul wanted to do was hurt David on every level. Physically, yes. If I can't do that, emotionally, mentally, that works just as well. But even after the death of Saul, the conflict doesn't come to an end. You will recall that after Saul's death, the commander of Saul's army, one Abner, sets up another surviving son of Saul, Ishbosheth, as king in Israel. And again, I think we need to sort of step back and clarify that David did not wish any harm to come to Ishbosheth. He did not view him as a mortal enemy that needed to be exterminated. But it cannot be ignored that the fact that Ishbosheth took the throne for the tribes of what we would consider to be Israel versus just the tribe of Judah, that delays David reigning over a unified Israel for another 8.5 years. 8.5 years of civil war by the reckoning of 2 Samuel chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. And so now David has an opportunity to interact with another member of this family, another member of this house. Now, if you can, just for the moment, sort of set aside what you know of the story and how you may know the story ending, if you're just reading this as a narrative that unfolds, the entirety of the history of David's relationship with the house of Saul, setting Jonathan to the side, has been one of conflict, fighting, and hurt. How would you expect this relationship to go? You know, even if you could imagine yourself to be a very generous, a very giving person, after you've suffered all of those injuries, all of those insults, how might you feel toward any surviving member? Well, that is the perspective that I try to imagine from David. But now I'd like for us to think for a moment about Mephibosheth. And again, just a word of disclaimer. I understand, and we understand as readers, that what had taken place was God's will, that Saul had been rejected as king, and David was reigning because this is what God had dictated to take place. But you're Mephibosheth. You're one of the few, if only surviving members of the house of Saul. And just from a practical perspective, the facts remain that David, this is the man who has taken the place that was previously occupied by your family. You remember when when Saul was so upset at Jonathan for being friends with David, and he says, "Don't you know as long as the son of Jesse lives?" He says, "The kingdom's not going to be yours," and who knows if Mephibosheth is going to think in terms as the way Jonathan thought, or if he's going to be more like his grandfather Saul. The things that had been owned by the house of Saul, those were now in the hands of David. Now, David was not the one who killed King Saul or his sons, but David was not fighting with Saul either. Now, we know the reasons for that, but in the eyes of many, those who supported the claims of Ishbosheth and backed Abner, you have Saul being killed by the Philistines, which would be Israel's greatest enemy. And where was David when this happened? Well, he's living among the Philistines. It was the defeat of Saul that led to Mephibosheth being a cripple. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 4 that Mephibosheth had been 5 years old when Saul and Jonathan had been slain. And what happened was that the news of this battle and really the impending, you would assume, invasion and spoiling in the surrounding areas, that reached the nurse of Mephibosheth, and she is hurrying to flee, and in her hurry, she drops the child who is injured in the fall. On another note, Ishbosheth. David was not responsible for the death of Mephibosheth's uncle, but we do read in the following verses of that chapter in 2 Samuel 4 that there were men who were thinking that this would get them in the good graces of David. And so, not by his request, of their own volition, they murder Ishbosheth in his own bed. You just think about it from that perspective. It's a dangerous time to be a member of the house of Saul. People in the house of Saul are dying left and right. Do you really want to be known as being a part of that family? So David, throughout all of this, he has settled down into a life of power, of prestige and wealth. And here you have Mephibosheth, the once future king, having lived out his life in comparable poverty. He's now an exile. He is a cripple. Again, how would you expect a meeting of these two parties to play out? I mean, just base that on what you see in our culture today. Our culture that is so prone to division, that is so prone to constantly being angered and moved toward hatred at the slightest perceived offense, and always ready to blame, always ready to point the finger. And here you have men whose lives have experienced real hurt, real trauma at the hands of the houses of one another, at least from certain perspectives. I think you have all of the necessary ingredients for this situation to blow up, to be a disaster. Well, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Let's turn back there for a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 9, we'll start reading in verse 6. So Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, Here is your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will surely show loving kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table continually. So he prostrated himself and said, What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? Then the king called Saul's young man Ziba and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and all to his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food and eat of it. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table continually. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Now Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table continually, and he was lame in both feet. Again, I think I'm a little behind on my slides here. Forgive me for that. But I think that by all expectations, just on the outside looking in, this meeting ought to have been one where there was blame, where there was anger, where there were accusations. Whose family had done the most harm to whom? Here's what I've lost. Here's what I've lost. Well, this is what your grandfather did to me. Well, where were you when Saul needed you most? Who's the rightful owner of what? Instead, two men who should have been enemies are described as now living together as family. And I think that there are some key factors in our text that tell us why this came out the way that it did. I think the first of those is a great deal of humility. Again, I don't want to draw everything to the way that our culture may be tempted to do things, but if you're in Mephibosheth's shoes, maybe you show up, you've got a little bit of a chip on your shoulder, you've got some grievances, or it's about time you called me here. I was wondering when you were gonna finally get around to honoring all those things that you said to my father. But instead of anger, instead of showing up and making demands, here's what you must do to make things right for me, he places himself at David's mercy. Here is your servant. Why should you even regard a dead dog like me? Well, for David, here you have a physical reminder of your tormentor, and yet there is no hint of taking out vengeance on Saul's actions on this member of the family. Instead, there's just really unimaginable generosity. You're going to have everything that was owned by Saul. Now it's yours. And even though I'm giving you this, it's not even really to earn you a living. You're not going to need to worry about money. You're going to stay with me. You're going to eat at my table. You're going to live with me as though you were my own son. Well, I think about the attitude, the spirit of gratefulness that surely defined both of these men. I think Mephibosheth could have acted as though he was only coming into possession of those things that were rightfully his. Yeah, well, you're going to give me my grandfather's lands? Good. That's what's right. That's what's just. Do you want a pat on the back for this? Instead, he is profoundly impacted by the generosity of King David. David, on the other hand, could have parted with these lands with great reluctance. What will it take to set things right between us, for me to honor my covenant with Jonathan? Can I just write you a check? Do you want some donkeys, some mules? Is that going to be enough? No. All the lands, they're yours. These servants, they're going to work for you. They're going to cultivate the land. David is genuinely grateful that he now has the opportunity to show that goodness to the household of Saul. I think that the other driving factor in this is the concept of being loyal, of having an understanding of what it means to be in a covenant with someone else. David had committed himself into the service of Saul, and he had done so to the point that even long after Saul had given up any pretense of honoring David, David shows his loyalty to Saul for the rest of Saul's life. David was honoring that covenant. He was honoring a covenant that he had made with another member of Saul's family. In 1 Samuel chapter 23, in verse 15, then David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. Now David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. So Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you, and Saul my father knows that also." So the two of them cut a covenant before Yahweh, and David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. In just a moment, I want to read from chapter 20, but to me, this is one of the most heartbreaking passages, the exchange between David and Jonathan, as Jonathan sort of looks to the future, not that would come to pass, but the future that he desired. that you're going to be king over Israel, and I'm going to be your right-hand man. I'm going to be right there with you. And my father knows that. Sadly, that would not come to pass because of Saul's foolishness and recklessness. I think back to chapter 20 and verse 42, where Jonathan says to David, "Go in peace, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of Yahweh, saying, Yahweh will be between me and you, and between my seed and your seed forever." Then he arose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. David's loyalty, his understanding of his word that he had given, lasted long after the death of Saul. It lasted long after the death of Jonathan. We said at the start that this is a somewhat unique story of forgiveness. And I don't think I'm stretching the definition to apply that to this story. I think that's the best way to describe it. Because you have two men, both of whom have suffered great hurt, and both of these men could have, by, I think, any objective standard, laid some of the blame at the feet of the other. If not, they could have at least seen each other as a viable outlet to sort of vent their frustration. Even if you're not the one, you're close enough. You'll do. But through these attitudes of humbleness, gratefulness, and loyalty, they chose a path of reconciliation. I think that those are the necessary ingredients that we have to embrace ourselves. When I think about conflict, what is the surest way to keep a conflict going? Well, both of you keep arguing. Both of you keep insisting that you were right. Both of you keep on until you can declare yourself the winner. But what is the quickest way to stop any conflict in its tracks? Well, foolish man stirs up wrath, or grievous, I've got a brain fog on me. A mighty fog has come upon me. Two proverbs warring in my head. Well, I can at least say that a soft answer turns away wrath, even if it doesn't turn away the fog in my brain. Just say, all right, I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm sorry that you've been hurt. What can we do to make the situation right? When there is disunity, when there are relationships that need to be mended, it's not going to happen if at least one party is not willing to embrace an attitude of humility. Someone who is willing to say, I'm not going to let it go on. I'm not going to be the one who continues to perpetuate. And whatever it takes to make things right, whatever it takes to see this relationship restored, I'll be the one. Why not suffer loss, as Paul said to the Corinthians? Well, I think the attitude of gratefulness enters in, and the giving and the receiving. When we talk about negotiations, the one thing that we want to do when we're negotiating, we want to be the one at the table that has the power. We have the upper hand. I'm going to walk away with the most favorable circumstance from this. But this is not a time to either seek power or exert power. There is gratefulness when we are in the position to relieve the burden of someone else. Someone who needs our forgiveness. Someone who is yearning to have that relationship back. And we can take that burden off of their shoulders, saying, yes, I forgive you as well. There's gratefulness when we're in the position to have ours taken away, when we're the one who is wronged or hurt another. And I think about the understanding of loyalty as well. I said that David showed covenant loyalty. He was acting out of loyalty to the covenant that he had made with God, as well as with Jonathan. And I think that when we, as a covenant people who have entered into that relationship with our Lord, when we think about our covenant and the forgiveness that he has bestowed to us, that enables us to have an attitude and a heart to forgive others. That should empower us to more eagerly seek out reconciliation with one another. How can we help? But when we think about what God has done for us, the loyalty, the faithfulness that he has shown to each of us, how can we not be moved to show that to anyone to whom it is in our power to do so? In just a moment, we're going to be singing the song that was selected. So if you would like to, you can go ahead and be getting those songbooks out so we don't have to scramble for them. But as you're doing that and we draw our study to a close this evening, we want to extend an invitation for all of us to take advantage of the forgiveness that we can find in Christ. For those who have not yet obeyed the gospel, the opportunity is before us tonight. You can experience the wonderful, beautiful gift of forgiveness made possible by the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Be baptized, have your sins forgiven. And maybe in our number tonight, there are those who simply would like prayers, would like encouragement and strength from the brethren here. I know that they would be glad to offer them for you. So if we can help you, if we can encourage you this evening, the invitation is yours as we get ready to stand and sing.
Someday you'll stand